It's just wonderful to have a reunion here tonight and be celebrating Lynn Tillman's wonderful, wonderful book. And I'd like to thank Nicholas Rojas and Gloria Troy for all they've done for the programs that I've done here and for organizing this wonderful program. And now it's such a pleasure for me to introduce Lynn Tillman, who walked into my life 3 years ago when I was planning this book, which I thought was going to celebrate our 20th anniversary. Instead, it turned out to be the whole closing of the bookstore and a kind of history of what had gone on in literature and in publishing over the last 20 years. So she just did an incredible job, and through it, she's become one of my dearest and closest friends. And she's a wonderful, wonderful writer. Her new book in paperback, No Lease on Life, was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and so that is available. Her other novels are Cast in Doubt, Motion Sickness, and Haunted Houses. And she has 2 collections of short fiction, The Madame Realism Complex and Absent Makes the Heart, The Broad Picture and The Velvet Years, Warhol's Factory, and other books. And she's co-director of the writing department of Bard College. She was a visiting professor at Brown University and a visiting critic for the Critical Issues Seminar in Yale University's Graduate Sculpture Department. Lynn is very, very distinguished. So we'd like to welcome Lynn Tillman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very exciting to see all of you out here, so many friends and so many of the people who were in the book, and I'm just thrilled. I want to introduce to you a really extraordinary writer and wit, Fran Lebowitz. She honors the book by being in it. She contributed such wonderful ideas and thoughts about the city and about bookstores and about everything, and I've also gotten to know her a little bit during the past few years, and it's really a privilege and an honor to introduce her to you. Fran Lebowitz.
Hello. First, I would like to say, either the rest of you are disgracefully underdressed, or as soon as I'm finished, I'll bring you the wine list. Lynn is great and shorter than me. Right. I was told, in fact, commanded by both Jeanette and Lynn, that what I should read to you tonight were things that I said that are in the book. And I thought this was because I believe that life is fair. I thought everybody was told this. So apparently everyone else got to choose. I would not have chosen to read my own conversation to you. For numerous reasons, but chief among them, well, it would be a good lesson for all of those of you who think that writing and talking are the same thing. And also because I didn't get to edit this, I'll try to edit a little as I go along. But not fair is so this little bit of rambling conversation is about Bert Britton, who was originally Jeanette's partner. But before he was Jeanette's partner at the bookstore, he ran the review set. He ran a number of things at the Strand bookstore. And I'd known him since I was a teenager, actually. So this is me talking. It's very contemporary, isn't it? I had known Bert for many years by the time Books and Company started. The second I started writing for little magazines, and I cannot stress the word little enough, I would get books in the mail. You can tell that no one really wants books. You can tell how highly valued they are by the fact that a 19-year-old kid writing for a magazine with a circulation of 6 gets inundated with hundreds of review copies. The books you didn't want, you would bring to the Strand, which paid a quarter, I think, of the retail price. So basically, this accounted for, at various times, between a quarter and a third of my income. I remember once getting $70 in cash. My rent was $121.78. So that was a very substantial sum of money. I always felt Bert gave you more than you were supposed to get. He would take the books, and it was like watching a card shark shuffle a deck of cards. It was the only experience I have ever had in my life where I got more than I thought I was going to get. When Paul Auster reads that, it'll sound better.
All my messages are from friends.
There won't be much left. Slim pickings from Mr. Auster. Remember 4th Avenue when they had all the secondhand bookstores? You had to beg those guys to sell you a book. You had to scream and yell to get their attention because they were always reading. Remember those horrible old grumpy guys? You would say, "How much is this?" They would grumble, "I don't know, put a figure on it." Could you give me some idea of how much? So booksellers always agreed not to make a lot of money. What they didn't agree to was what has happened since the chains came in. No one can agree to that because that's not just agreeing not to make a lot of money, that's agreeing to starve to death. And it's very hard to get people's consensus on that. Let's see. You're having to guess the questions, by the way, because Lynn took them out. I would be in favor of the chains if they stayed out of cities. They are anti-urban. There are many places in this country that have no bookstore. Because there are no places left in the country, there are just malls. So then you have a chain in a mall, and that makes sense. It's better than not having any bookstore. But in a city, you don't want this, because the point of a city, to me, is, why did we move here? Did we move here because there weren't enough chain stores where we came from? We came from there. That's why we came here. We didn't come here because we had a burning desire to pay $8,000 a month rent. We came here to get away from that. Now that is here. Now there's no place to go. The things that make a city are the opposite things that are exemplified by these chains. My anger at the chains is that they came here. Bookstores, coffee stores, whatever. We want all the little junky weird places. That's why we came here. It's like the smoking laws. What did New York have? Why do tourists come here? Now New York is full of tourists. It's all Giuliani ever talks about. He's turned New York into a tourist attraction. That means it's over. There's nothing to see. They come to see the remnants. They come to see the ruins, like ancient Greece. There's nothing here anymore. This isn't anymore a place to make books, it is a place to sell them. It is not a place to make paintings, it is a place to sell them. Always writers and artists sit around and drink and talk and smoke cigarettes. Now they make a place where you can't do that. This is not supposed to be a health spa. No one ever moved here for their health. You want to be in a healthy environment? Think of anywhere else. Why do they have to turn New York City into a suburb when there are already plenty of them? Why this city had to be made comfortable for the middle-class American white tourist, I have no idea. There is never a consideration of the native population. We are the indigenous population of this city. We deserve to be here. They do not. They knocked down Times Square, so where did our hookers have to go? Where are our hookers? Where are our 3-card Monte dealers? Giuliani says all this is bringing in business, like the Virgin Record Store. He's not even an American. All this money, all this Hard Rock Cafe stuff, all these themed restaurants, they don't live here. The money goes right out of the city. That isn't money put back into the city except in the form of taxes, and if they weren't here, there would be other stores here. Our stores were here. Bergdorf's, Tiffany's, that's what belongs uptown. Does Kmart belong here? No, it does not. We had a very nice Woolworths. Writers and readers get attached to their bookstore, then they take it away. But that's what constitutes a city, the places you go. The idea behind the chains is, let's make a bookstore for people who don't feel comfortable in bookstores, who are intimidated by bookstores. Let's make a city for people who are intimidated by bookstores. I'm not running for anything. I don't have to say I trust the people. I do not. Stay home. Do we go there? I don't know what the paradigm is of a store that America feels comfortable in. A supermarket, I guess. We don't have supermarkets in New York. We still don't. I would like to be the mayor of New York for one term. I would make this place so uncomfortable for tourists you have no idea. I would give New York back to the New Yorkers. But I know one thing. I'm not popular enough to be the mayor. It does occasionally bring a chill to my heart that there are more people who like Giuliani than like me. It's also pretty scary to think that there are more people who like Jesse Helms than like me. Of course, this was before last week. So I suppose because of these remarks, can be classified as a premature anti-fascist. So this is apparently in response to something Lynn or Jeanette said about the panels that they had at Books and Companies, and this is in regard to a screenwriting panel, which I was not on. The most unhappy people I have ever met are screenwriters. If what you're interested in is movies, then it's fine to be a screenwriter, but if what you're interested in is writing, it's absurd to be a screenwriter. It is not a writer's medium. You have no control, and as I always say, why do you think they give you all that money? I remember being on a panel at Books and Company because I haven't very frequently been on panels, maybe 24 times in my life. I remember all of them to some extent because I dislike being on panels. I don't like other people being allowed to talk. A panel always means that I'm going to be with about 6 people who don't agree with me. I suppose in an audience of 2,000 people, they won't agree with you, but they're not allowed to talk. I expect people to disagree with me, but I do not expect them to be allowed to talk. That is why I don't like being on panels. Thank you. Good night.
She's just amazing. People have asked me how I did this book, so I thought I would, in fact, one of the responses to this book is, Lynn, how did you do it? So I thought I would read a couple of paragraphs from the introductory essay, because often introductory essays are not read, and it might explain to you a little bit about how I did this. When I began researching Books and Company's history, I discovered how inextricably it was part of Jeanette Watson's life. I'd never met Jeanette before. I was not a native informant. I'd never read at the store. I'd bought books there from time to time, attended some readings. It represented my books, but it wasn't my bookstore. I knew almost nothing about its history. Though I was a writer, I also knew very little about how a bookstore worked. My job, I told myself, was in part to make that understandable. How a bookstore operates, how books get chosen and why, how a philosophy animates each independent bookstore. I also wanted to look at the roles of editors, publicists, sales reps, and publishers who figuratively deliver books to bookstores. Jeanette Watson once told me her store was a 19th century idea. She told me she wanted her love of books to be communicated in an ideal place for them. Writers sometimes invoke the ideal reader, publishers the general reader. Muses for each group, these ideal types are inventions, probably necessary illusions. And just as authors, in a way, create their readers with each new book, traditionally independent bookstores create their customers. No two independent bookstores are exactly alike in selection of books or ambiance. I'll jump. Writing this book was a combination of doing history, cultural history, and biography. I hadn't expected it to be biography. Once I started working with the material, I realized I needed to tell Jeanette's story. The impulse to start Books and Company was hers, and her desire and commitment gave birth to the store and kept it going. Writing her biography from the interviews was like being a portraitist. Jeanette was, in a way, my material, my primary source material. If she were sitting in front of me, then I was using many of her words, her expressions, to draw from and paint with, interpreting them and augmenting them to make a continuous, fairly chronological narrative. In a sense, I turned information into narration. The interviews, of course, did not go from A to B. I asked many questions, and we talked about many things, sometimes in no specific order. From the interviews, letters, and her diaries, I had to establish links between events, make inferences and segues, and forge conclusions that seemed appropriate, using Jeanette's actual words when possible. I decided to keep her voice in the first person, like the other contributors, to maintain the book's immediacy and directness. I had to think as if I were Jeanette and recall events in her life as if they were mine. It was as if I were writing her autobiography. It was a strange experience, something out of Mind Invaders, and as much as I appreciated the dedication of biographers before, I respect them even more now. More conventionally, I did oral history too, organizing the other interviewees' material, selecting and editing commentaries to interrupt Jeanette's story. These interventions would amplify or diverge from the tale she was telling, and there was an enormous number of possibilities. The range of topics and expression was gloriously broad, beautifully articulated, and the reader of Bookstore will find a fuller discussion of some of the issues I've touched upon earlier in this essay, and much more. But Jeanette's voice kept the narrative going. She was the engine. Others could stroll down memory lane and bring into it other memories and themes. I wanted to include as much as I could. This book's design was to showcase, along with Jeanette's life and her stores, many other lives and ideas, the way good bookstores do. People go to bookstores for many reasons. People read for many reasons. We enter these stores with expectation. Perhaps we readers want to find ourselves in everything we read. But if it's in a book, and much is, booksellers try to fulfill the reader's demand. It's not an easy job, just as writing books or publishing them is not. A bookstore is not only a cultural space, but also a social space and a place for fantasy and desire. It is a business place, too, subject to the market, to changing business practices and consumer tastes, and all of this is in the story of Books & Company. To me, the store became a living entity, a house full of voices, many of which are presented in Bookstore. I hope that Bookstore will live as a kind of book of books, a book for people who love them and who care about the fascinating business of bringing them into our world. Thank you. And now here's Jeanette.
Well, I thought I would read some of Brendan Gill's because he helped me so much start the bookstore, and he's so much a part of the Municipal Arts Society and the Landmarks Conservancy, and I wish that he could be here tonight to celebrate the book. So here's his description of me. It says, in that family, Jeanette was the bookish one, curled up with books while the others were more physical, out in the world, more like her wonderful father, Thomas. He was one of the most charismatic, extraordinary people I ever met. He was so charismatic to the point where if he told you something was so, it was not only so, but you would back it with your own life. For example, once he invited me to fly up to Stowe for a skiing weekend, and we were to meet in Westchester and fly up. A blizzard came, and the airport was closed. Actually, one of Jack Kennedy's close friends was also supposed to be going up with his girlfriend. And when they saw the storm and the airport closed, they begged off. But Tom said, I'm going out. Do you want to come, Brendan? I said, of course I'll come, because it was Tom Watson. It was a plane he had not flown often before, and he was going to fly himself. He had a co-pilot, but he had a book of instructions spread on his legs, and then he said into the microphone, I'm taking responsibility for this flight, and I'm getting out of here. They put the lights on, and we went off in the snow. When we got up in the air, it turned out the airport in Stowe was also closed, and Tom had gotten in touch with somebody, and they opened up another airport, newly plowed, just for us. And Tom, this was the commonplace. Another time, he had to get back to New York City, and Tom said, I have a helicopter that has something the matter with it, and I'm flying it to Boston, and you can catch a regular commercial flight. Again, no hesitancy on my part. Here's a helicopter, which I hate, and there's something the matter with it, and we're going to take off. It was summer, and Tom had his shorts rolled up, and on the way off the island and down to Boston, he was making notations on his bare skin, his upper thigh, and I thought, here I am, thousands of feet in the air, with a man who has had a massive heart attack and just recovered from it, And there are certain extraordinary notations on his upper leg. And if he had another heart attack, what do I do? How do I read the upper leg of a dead man? I knew Tom would get me to Boston. There wasn't a chance in the world we wouldn't get to Boston. That's the way he was. And then I have one other selection. Susan Scott was at Books and Company for 8 years, and she worked with Peter, and she became a floor manager, and she described what happened at a reading with Bernard Malamud. When Bernard Malamud was reading, we began hearing extremely strange and inexplicable noises. Andrew had been adjusting the microphone and all the sound equipment, and the sound equipment was just held together with Band-Aids. It barely functioned. There was only one person usually who knew how to paste it together so it would work. Andrew thought he had it all set. Then we started hearing a bizarre noise, a noise never heard before, one Andrew didn't know how to deal with. I looked up in Malamud and said, "My God, it's his pacemaker." Andrew had to run upstairs and take the mic away from his chest, move it further up toward his face so it wouldn't pick up the noise. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Philbrook, who is the manager at Books and Company for 15 years and was just a famous buyer. When no one had ever heard of Perfume by Patrick Susskind, he ordered 700 copies of it. And I was terrified that we wouldn't be able to sell them, but we sold every single one. He also ordered a great many of The Name of the Rose. He was a brilliant, brilliant buyer. And now Peter is at Barnes & Noble, and he runs an out-of-print website. So you can go there to find wonderful out-of-print books, and you should be very happy to learn that he's starting an academic website. So all of those great philosophy books and things that you could find at Books and Company, now you can go to Peter and find at Barnes & Noble. So let's welcome Peter Philbrook.
Hi. Welcome to Books and Company. I'm saying that now because I always hated saying it before. When I thought about what I was going to read tonight, I came up with nothing, so I'm going to tell a story. And the reason for that is there's a place in the book where Jeanette mentions how painfully shy I was, which I think was an exaggeration. No. You said I wouldn't look people in the eye. In fact, I was alienated. It was alienation, but and I was proud of that at the time. But I can't speak in front of an audience, basically. That's the problem. It's kind of a Viennese neurosis, you know. Like Lucille couldn't touch money, but so this is like torture for me to do this. And the most painful part of Books and Company, so we have to have both sides, was introducing readings. And I didn't really have to do it very often because I always found a way to get out of it. But Jeanette was sympathetic, but she also would torture me because she would say, well, I'm going to be away. No, who's going to do the introduction? Or if I suggested a reader, then I would have to introduce him. And she would always really zing me. Because actually, she was terrible when she began doing introductions, but over the years, she got great. And she trained herself, do the pebbles in the mouth and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, and one of the worst introductions I ever did was for Paul Auster. I remember, probably no one remembers this, but it was for City of Glass, and I was really I did a lot to prepare this, and I got a couple anecdotes ready of our friendship and how we met, and it was beautiful. But I began the introduction, and I forgot half of the anecdote, one anecdote, but everybody just let that go. And I went on, and I remember the second one, I forgot half of that too, and everyone was just kind of like looking around. I think you, yeah, and so it's like, it was really like a Beckett story, which Paul would understand, but so I can't go on, I'll go on. I think I've said my piece, I've done it. Thank you for asking me to speak, and thank you. Goodbye.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Paul Auster. Paul has been was a long time customer of Books and Company, and he also read there many times and had a book party there, or maybe 2 book parties there, and Jeanette gave him a dinner. I mean, not that he hadn't been eating, but the days were more skint anyway, right? His latest book is Timbuktu. It's a wonderful book, and he's a wonderful writer and a terrific person. And please welcome Paul Auster.
Thank you, Lynn. Unlike Fran Lebowitz, I couldn't stand the idea of reading my own comments, so I picked some other people's that I think are wonderful. The first one is really a delicious bit of memory about books by Simon Schama, the historian. There's nothing to do with Books and Company, but it's about books. I was a bit of an embarrassment because I was reading at 2 or something, or so my parents tell me. My father, I wouldn't normally believe because he used to brag irrationally about me, but my mother, as in a classic Jewish household, would contradict everything. And she agrees that I was reading very, very early. I remember reading Comics Classics Illustrated. They had a version, I seem to remember, of a Bible. There would be Isaiah standing there in his little pajamas with an enormous bubble coming out of his mouth with the whole of the prophecy of Isaiah, or Elijah being fed by the ravens. I thought this was very cool. I remember where I grew up on Lee-on-Sea in Essex. There was an old used bookstore that was full of old almanacs. It had things like The Life of Napoleon. But I remember one of the first things that I saw was an old photographic history that was published in 1936, I think it was, for George V, for the 25th anniversary of his coronation. So it was actually a kind of history of Britain from the death of Queen Victoria to baby George V, the most boring king of the 20th century. It had lots of pictures and little text. The trench warfare in the First World War. I remember it had embossed blue covers, and it was very heavy, and the photographs were all kind of sepia brown. I was very, very fascinated by this book. I would come back to the bookstore to look at it, and it was 2 shillings or something, more than my pocket money. But I kept on coming back, and in the end, the bookseller gave it to me. He was so tired. I must have been about 6 or 7. It was very nice. I must have been this rather comical little figure at the time. There was something about the smell of old books. They had a rather pudding-y smell. I was very interested in, literally, the smell of different papers and books, old books and new books. I remember an old British publisher used this very pulpy, soft kind of doughy paper that was wonderful. You could press your little thumb into it and it would make a little indentation. And others, Dent, for example, had a very shiny, slightly strange stock, quite like coated paper. Somehow, the actual tactile qualities of books appealed to me. Foxing, when really old books develop brown spots, was very interesting to me. These strange, measle-like blemishes would appear. And when I first saw my first wormhole, that was incredibly exciting too. I was looking on through wormholed books to see if the worm was still there or the body of the worm was. Wormholes that have really eaten their way through pages go sideways through the book, so there's a pattern from one page to the next. I thought those were amazingly interesting. I was living in the seaside, and my other great passion was to beachcomb, and you could see seaworms and tiny critters burrowing. Books seemed to me to have this kind of oceanic, almost primordial quality. I loved all that as much as I loved the first pictures. Very sexual, very sensuous. And the next one is from Roy Blunt, a very funny man. I've had the pleasure of meeting a few times. And he described something that went on in the store. I think there was some kind of party for his book, the Book of Southern Humor. He was reading from it, which is an anthology. So here's Roy Blunt, Jr. I've been going around talking about this book here and there, and the first most common question I find on the book tour is, as you sit down heavily next to someone and sort of cringe and wait for the first question, the first question is, do you get tired of hearing the same questions over and over? Of course you can't say yes, The terrible thing is because then the program's just dead if you say yes. The second one lately has been, what do you think of Newt? I have a lot more to say about that. I've been looking for Republicans all day today. They ought to come up with a new name for Newt, because you name a boy Newt, you get a mean boy. So I thought the Republican should call him Jubilation T. Gingrich or something. Or if they changed his name to Isaac Newton Gingrich, they could call him Ike. But I hope they don't think of that. It might work. But one of the things about Southern humor is, as I've gotten tired of saying, that it derives from a rich oral tradition. There's also a rich nasal tradition, obviously, in Southern humor. It's a rich oral tradition, but it seemed to me that the only person in the last election who seemed to be coming from that rich oral tradition was Ann Richards, who got beat. And the ones who didn't get beat came from a poor anal tradition. So that's what I've been saying about politics. And I've also been saying that there are three essential elements of Southern humor. One is that it's very oral. It derives from the aforesaid rich oral tradition, and it also involves animals quite often. And it also involves food, eating. So if you consider an oyster an animal, the following poem, by myself, brings all those elements together. It goes like this. I like to eat an uncooked oyster. Nothing's slicker, nothing's moister. Nothing's easier on your gorge or when the time comes to discharge, but not to let it too long rest. Within your mouth is always best. For if your mind dwells on an oyster, nothing's slicker, nothing's moister. I prefer my oyster fried. Then I'm sure my oysters died. That pretty much sums up Southern humor. And then the last bit, on a completely different note, but I found very touching and in some way an emblem of what Books and Company really was as a bookstore. It's a description by Calvin Trillin of Joe Mitchell's reading there in, I guess, the early 90s. And here's Calvin Trillin speaking. Joe Mitchell hadn't published anything in the New Yorker for about 30 years. Then Up in the Old Hotel came out in 1992. Then in about 1994, they put out The Bottom of the Harbor. He was sort of the hero to a lot of people my age at the New Yorker and not at the New Yorker, a nonfiction writer. It was almost a cult. Most people had never heard of him, but he was the best nonfiction writer, at least in my view, the New Yorker ever had. He wrote not about grandiose subjects, but the Fulton Street Fish Market and the Bowery and various things like that. I never heard of him until just before I came to the New Yorker. Somebody gave me one of his books, and it was just astonishing. I don't write the way he wrote. I don't mean that it was stylistically influential, but I think a lot of writers, roughly my contemporaries, saw him as an extraordinary figure. Then, of course, the mystery of his not writing added to it. When The Bottom of the Harbor was put out by the Modern Library, Jeanette had a reading for him. It was 2 or 3 years after Up in the Old Hotel came out. But still I thought of him as someone who wasn't well known, even though I think Up in the Old Hotel might have been on the bestseller list briefly. Alice and I had promised to be at somebody's house for dinner that night, but we thought we would stop and pay our respects. We couldn't get in the building. There were people out the door, on the street. It was fantastic, and a lot of them were young people. I was just astonished. I told Jeanette the next day there was like a rock star or something like that. We finally edged up the stairs just to say hello because we had to leave. It was a wonderful event because you knew that people who went into that store appreciated Joe Mitchell. It didn't have to be somebody whose name was in the paper and the gossip columns every day. He must have been, I guess, a retiring type. And then, as a footnote to that story, Brendan Gill continues the story of that reading. That was one of the high moments of Joe Mitchell's life. He'd never done a reading before. I was supposed to introduce him, and I got there at 6 or something. It was absolutely so jam-packed that there was no way for me to get upstairs. I heard Jeanette introducing him. You couldn't get through the crowd, even on the ground floor, and looking out through the shop window, I saw the street was full of people for Joe Mitchell. He was 87 years of age. What could have been more thrilling for him? And he thought he couldn't read. He was pretty much of a stammerer and very uneasy speaking, and he thought, oh God. Every word coming out was very difficult when he spoke to even old friends like me. But in point of fact, when he got up to speak, He did an absolutely great job. It was great, and he was so happy after that. Then, just a few weeks later, he was dead. He had all kinds of cancer that he didn't know about. Thanks.
Okay. So now Lynn and I are going to read the end of the book, which is so touching that I hope I'm not going to cry while I read it. She just did a great job. But I want to end this book, close its door where Books and Company's heart was, with a writer reading her work to readers, to an enthusiastic audience. Our last reading was on May 15th, 1997, and our last reader was the exceptional Edna O'Brien. Edna and Jean Moreau were longtime friends, and another connection, only connect. It was Jean Moreau who first told Edna O'Brien that she should patronize Books and Company, so it happened that our very last reader was a friend in her own Irish right.
After Edna finished her remarkable reading, her voice is like the richest chocolate, she addressed the audience again. That's enough of me, thank you very much. I would just like to say one thing, that I know for Jeanette and for all her friends what an emotional and poignant and painful evening it must be. But the thing about whatever ends in our lives, whether it be a place or a person, they do not end in the memory and imagination and spirit of the people. And I'm sure this bookshop will be a legend forever, and I'm so honored to be a part of what's happening now, and bless you all.
I returned to the podium and gave my last speech at the store. It was a singular moment. It was the store's swan song. But I was a bookseller to the end. I thanked the audience for coming, thanked Edna for her reading and gracious remarks, and then encouraged everyone to buy a copy of her book and get it signed. Edna had ended the evening just the way I liked it, on a hopeful note. I did hope that Books and Company and what it stood for would live on in people's hearts and minds. And now I encourage you all to buy the book.
Thank you so much for coming.
Doubt, Motion Sickness, and Haunted Houses. And she has 2 collections of short fiction, The Madame Realism Complex and Absent Makes the Heart. The Broad Picture and The Velvet Years, Warhol's Factory, and other books. And she's co-director of the writing department of Bard College. She was a visiting professor at Brown University and a visiting critic for the Critical Issues Seminar in Yale University's Graduate Sculpture Department. Lynn is very, very distinguished. So we'd like to welcome Lynn Tillman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very exciting to see all of you out here, so many friends and so many of the people who are in the book, and I'm just thrilled. I want to introduce to you a really extraordinary writer and wit, Fran Lebowitz.
Demanded by both Jeanette and Lynn that what I should read to you tonight were things that I said that are in the book. And I thought this was because I believe that life is fair. I thought everybody was told this. So apparently everyone else got to choose. I would not have chosen to read my own conversation to you. For numerous reasons, but chief among them, well, it would be a good lesson for all of those of you who think that writing and talking are the same thing. And also because I didn't get to edit this, I'll try to edit a little as I go along. But not fair is so this little bit of rambling conversation is about Bert Britton, who was originally Jeanette's partner. But before he was Jeanette's partner at the bookstore, he ran the review set.
It's just wonderful to have a reunion here tonight and be celebrating Lynn Tillman's wonderful, wonderful book. And I'd like to thank Nicholas Rojas and Gloria Troy for all they've done for the programs that I've done here and for organizing this wonderful program. And now it's such a pleasure for me to introduce Lynn Tillman, who walked into my life 3 years ago when I was planning this book, which I thought was going to celebrate our 20th anniversary. Instead, it turned out to be the whole closing of the bookstore and a kind of history of what had gone on in literature and in publishing over the last 20 years. So she just did an incredible job, and through it, she's become one of my dearest and closest friends. And she's a wonderful, wonderful writer. Her new book in paperback, No Lease on Life, was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and so that is available. Her other novels are cast in
a number of things at the Strand bookstore, and I had known him since I was a teenager, actually. So this is me talking. It's very contemporary, isn't it? I had known Bert for many years by the time Books and Company started. The second I started writing for little magazines, and I cannot stress the word little enough, I would get books in the mail. You can tell that no one really wants books. You can tell how highly valued they are by the fact that a 19-year-old kid writing for a magazine with a circulation of 6 gets inundated with hundreds of review copies. The books you didn't want, you would bring to the Strand, which paid a quarter, I think, of the retail price. So basically, this accounted for, at various times, between a quarter and a third of my income. I remember once getting $70 in cash. My rent was $121.78. So that was a very substantial sum of money. I always felt Bert gave you more than you were supposed to get.
Lebowitz, she honors the book by being in it. She contributed such wonderful ideas and thoughts about the city and about bookstores and about everything. And I've also gotten to know her a little bit during the past few years, and it's really a privilege and an honor to introduce her to you. Fran Lebowitz.
Hello. First, I would like to say, either the rest of you are disgracefully underdressed, or as soon as I'm finished, I'll bring you the wine list. Lynn is great and shorter than me. Right. I was told, in fact,